So in this chapter, we'll talk about financial leverage. The first question we'll ask is, why do we borrow to invest? That's because we do not have enough equity capital. Real estate investment usually requires a significant amount of capital compared to investment in stock and bond. And also, there are tax deductibility of the mortgage interest rate. So mortgage interest rate, you don't need to pay tax for that. And financial leverage, in case when your expected internal rate of return from the investment is higher than the effective interest rate. Effective interest rate including the contract rate, discount points, and other fees related to the borrowing. So if the IRR is higher than the cost of borrowing, financial leverage will provide a positive or favorable return to the investor. So the internal rate of return will be higher with debt than without debt. If we think about a physical leverage, what physical leverage did is we're trying to lift a heavier weight with a lighter weight. What we do is we have a different distance, try to achieve a better goal. When we think about financial leverage, for example, for financial leverage, we are trying to use 4 million equity investment to purchase a much larger property, to purchase a 10 million value property. So the leverage ratio in this case will be the value of the property divided by your equity investment is 2.5. So what we are trying to use financial leverage is trying to use a smaller amount of money to make a more expensive investment. What is the effect of leverage on risk? Financial leverage always increases the risk of the equity investment because under the optimistic scenarios, when you expect a really good economy or high return, the levered internal rate of return, which means the internal rate of return with borrowing money from the bank, is higher than the unlevered internal rate of return, which means you use all your equity investment to purchase the price of the property. But under the pessimistic scenarios, when the return is not so good in the future, the leveraged internal rate of return, which is the return when you use debt to purchase the property, is smaller than the unlevered internal rate of return, which is you use all the equity money to purchase the property. So what we can say is the leveraged case will have a higher variance of the return because in a good market, the return will be higher, and in the bad market, the return will be lower. What we need to keep in mind is we cannot influence the total property value through the use of debt. It doesn't matter you purchase the property with 90% loan to value ratio, 80% loan to value ratio, or 50% loan to value ratio. The property price is already determined by the market. However, the more money you borrow, the higher loan to value ratio, you need to pay a higher interest rate to the lender because the lender bears a higher risk. And also, the net operating income does not change when more money is borrowed. The net operating income really depends on the economic activities of the property. It's not affected by how you finance a property. However, before tax cash flow does change because if you borrow more debt from the bank, your debt service payment every period will be higher. Given the same net operating income, you will have a lower before tax cash flow if you use financial leverage. Borrower defaulting on their loan obligation, and ultimately they will lose their property to the lender through foreclosure because the lender will take the property as a collateral for the mortgage contract. In case of borrower default, the lender has the right to take the property. However, from the equity perspective, on the equity side, leverage increases the volatility of the return. So when the market is good, you have a higher levered return than the unlevered return. When the market is bad, you have a lower levered return than unlevered return. So the volatility, the change in the return on the different scenarios is higher in the case of financial leverage. Now let's look at an example of financial leverage. For example, there is an apartment project. The expected net operating income in the first period is $100,000. It increased 3% after the first period every year. Currently, the property is sold at $1 million, $900,000 of which is building value, and it will depreciate over 27.5 years. The price is expected to increase 3% during the 5-year holding period, and the sale cost 5 years later will be 60% of the sale price. Now you have two options. The number one option is no financing, which means you use all your equity money to finance a property. The number two is a conventional fixed rate mortgage. It's constant payment mortgage of the loan of $700,000 at 10% annual interest rate for 15 years terms. Now let's look at how does financial leverage affect the rate of return. In this example, what we can say is the asking price for the property is $1 million. First year NOI is $100,000. Growth in the NOI is 3%. Let's first look at the leverage case. The loan to value ratio is 70% at 10% interest rate for 15 years. Every year the payment is 12 payment. Appreciation rate for the price is 3%. Your holding years is 5 years. Selling cost is 6% of the sale price. For tax consideration, the building value is $900,000 depreciated at 27.5 years. Tax rate on income is 28%. Corporate gain tax rate is 20%. Depreciation recapture tax is 25%. So what we want to notice here, this example is exactly the same of the cash flow example we have been working before. So now let's look at the cash flow. It's $1 million property, so the loan to value ratio is 70%, which means equity value is $300,000 and loan amount is $700,000. We can calculate the annual payment. So the annual payment will just equals to the period payment, where the rate equals to 10% divided by 12. Number period equals to 15 years times 12. Present value equals to $700,000 and future value equals 0. We can calculate the monthly payment, and then with the monthly payment we times 12, which give us the annual loan payment. Keep in mind the cash flow per example is in annual term. And the mortgage at end of year 5, just let me denote it as a positive balance, okay? Now let's look at the summary of the loan information. And again, the annual payment is borrowing from the previous calculation, $90,267. So we know for the mortgage balance and the first year mortgage balance, we use the period payment and the number period equals 12 months. And for the second year balance, and we use the payment from the previous calculation, number period equals to 24 months. And for the third year, the number period equals to 36 months. For the fourth year, the number period equals to 48 months. And for the fifth period, number period equals to 60 months. We can calculate the mortgage balance. And now to calculate the principal is just the amount we have to pay down our outstanding balance. So for the first year, your outstanding balance just equals to the original loan amount minus the mortgage balance at the end of the first year, which is how much money you have to pay down out of your balance. And the principal in the second year just equals to the change in the mortgage balance from the first year to the second year. And the same thing, the principal amount for the third year just equals to a change from the second year to the third year. So we calculate the principal payment for each year. And then the payment is the same every year. We can calculate the interest payment because the mortgage payment every year included two parts, the principal payment and interest payment. So we use the annual payment minus the principal payment will give us the interest payment for each year. Why are we doing this? Because mortgage interest payment is tax deductible. when we calculate the tax, we need to subtract this interest from the tax calculation. And that is the summary of the loan information, which tells us what is the principal and interest payment every year. Now let's look at the cash flow here. So in this problem, the assumption is simplified. So we know the first year net operating income is $100,000. There are no operating expenses and other terms, which are all omitted here. So we can subtract debt service, which we calculated in the summary of loan information, from the net operating income we get before tax cash flow. And in the second year and in the following year, we were given that the net operating income increased at 3% every year. So in the second year, the NOI just equals the first year net operating income grow at 3%. And then for the third year, it just equals to the second year NOI grow at 3%. We calculate the NOI for each year. Debt service is the same mortgage payment for every period. And we subtract debt service from net operating income, we can get before tax cash flow for each of the year. Now let's look at after tax cash flow. So when NOI equals to $100,000, we less the interest payment for the first year, which is calculated in the loan summary information, all the interest payment for each of the year. So what we are doing is we just copy this interest information over here. And then we calculate depreciation. How do we calculate the depreciation? Here, we were given that the building value is $900,000, depreciated over 27.5 years. So we divided $900,000 by 27 per year, which give us annual depreciation. So that is the annual depreciation amount. Now the taxable income equals to the net operating income in each year minus the interest payment minus depreciation. We have the taxable income. And the tax rate on income is given as 28% here. So multiply 28% by this taxable income, give us the tax payment. And then we subtract this tax payment from before tax cash flow, which gave us after tax cash flow. We do the same thing for each year. What we want to note is, in the first year, our taxable income is negative. And we have learned about this before. In this case, we have a deep tax shelter, which means we do make a positive cash flow from the investment, but we still receive tax subsidy from the government rather than paying tax to the government. So that is a cash flow, before tax cash flow and after tax cash flow from operation. Now let's look at the cash flow from the sale of the year. Again, the sale price is assumed to grow at 3% every year for 5 years. Sale cost is assumed to be 6% of the sale price. The mortgage balance is calculated in earlier. We calculate mortgage balance at end of year 5. We can have before tax cash flow, which equals to sale price minus sale cost minus mortgage balance. Original cost basis, the purchase price is $1 million. There are no capital expenditure, so the adjusted basis is still $1 million. To calculate the capital gain, what we do is we subtract the sale cost from the sale price to give us net sale proceedings. And then net sale proceedings subtract the adjusted basis, give us capital gain tax. Capital gain tax rate is given as 20%. So 20% times capital gain give us capital gain tax. And accumulated depreciation, which equals to the depreciation every year times 5 years, so total amount of depreciation. And depreciation recapture tax rate is 25%. 25% times accumulated depreciation. So what we do now to obtain the after-tax cash flow from sales, we subtract capital gain tax and depreciation tax from the before-tax cash flow, give us after-tax cash flow from sales. Now let's look at the internal rate of return from financing. What we are doing here is we calculate the before-tax cash flow. Please note in the first in the beginning of the period, your equity investment is $700,000, which is the cash you take out of your own pocket, so it's a negative cash outflow. And then for each of the following years, we know what we are trying to do here is we're trying to copy the before tax cash flow from operation to the before tax cash flow here, except in the last year, we add before tax cash flow from operation with before tax cash flow from sales to get before tax cash flow total in last year. So we can use the IR function to calculate the internal rate of return is 15.74%. Now let's look at after-tax cash flow. That's the same thing. What we do is we just copy the after-tax cash flow from operation from year 1 to year 5. And then in the last year, we add after-tax cash flow from sale to the after-tax cash flow from operation for the last year in the holding period. We can look at the after-tax internal rate of return on equity will be 12.68%. So this is the internal rate of return with financing when we use financial leverage. How about the internal rate of return without financing? The internal rate of return without financing means your original investment is $1 million. You do not borrow any money from the bank. You just spend all your money for the purchase price, $1 million. And then we calculate before tax and after tax cash flow. So what we can do here, and because this is all linked, so let's just assume instead the loan to value ratio is 70%. Let's have a 0% loan to value ratio. And then this is the case when we do not use financial leverage. So we don't have any loan information. And we can get the before tax cash flow, after tax cash flow from operation, and before tax cash flow and after tax cash flow from sales. We just copy the number here, which will show us where this number comes from, the internal rate of return without financing. So that is when a simple trick is just change the loan to value ratio here, everything will be changed. Now let's look at the purpose we are trying to show this example. So in this example, what we know is, so this is internal rate of return with financing. This is internal rate of return without financing. You use all your money. What we can observe is the internal rate of return with financing here is higher than the internal rate of return without financing. So this just shows us, like in a very positive case, when we have a good growth rate for the rental income and a good growth rate for the property price, using financial leverage, using financing will give us a higher levered return than an unlevered return, which means we do not use financing. So that is the whole takeaway from this example. Now let's look at the main problem here. So when the income for the property is expected to increase, it is difficult for you to have a low loan to value ratio and a high debt coverage ratio during the initial years, because the value is based on the expected net operating income, but the debt coverage ratio will only use the first year net operating income. So the solution is to lower the initial payment. What are the alternative forms for the financial leverage? So the first we call the equity participation loans or equity kickers. So in this case, the lender will offer a lower interest rate to the borrower in order for the borrower to be able to pay a lower mortgage payment at the beginning and to be able to qualify for the loan application. However, this is not free. The lender offers a lower interest rate in return for participation in the growth in property price, or growth in NOI, or growth in cash flow of total sale proceedings, or the appreciation at the time of sale, but not in the equity. So the equity participation loan is not standard, which basically means the lender, they charge a lower interest rate on the mortgage, but they ask you to share your future cash flow with them at a certain ratio. And the terms is highly negotiable. Now let's look at an example for the equity participation loan here. Let's say you have apartment building. So everything here is the same as before. The expected NOI in the first year is $100,000. It increases at 3% every period. The property price now is $1 million. $900,000 is building value, depreciation over 27.5 years. The property price is expected to increase at 3% during the 5-year holding period, and sale cost is 6%. Now you have two options. So the first option is just the same as the financial leverage example we talked earlier. You have a conventional fixed rate mortgage, constant payment mortgage at $700,000, 10% 15-year term. Remember, we calculate the before tax internal rate of return and after tax internal rate of return for this example already. And the second option is really interesting. In the second option, you are still borrowing $700,000 from the lender, and the lender charges you a lower interest rate, 8% rather than 10% from the conventional mortgage. It's 15-year long term. However, the lender charges you a lower interest rate, but they will get 50% of any net operating income in excess of $100,000, plus 45% of any gains from the sale. So this is an equity participation example. The lender is willing to charge you a lower interest rate on mortgage, but as a return, you need to share future cash flow with the lender. Now, let's go back to the same Excel form, the second sheet, to look at the equity participation example. There, everything is almost the same as before. I just want to highlight what is the difference here. So here, we calculate the payment, except now the loan interest rate is 8% for the equity participation loans. So what we can say is we have lower annual payment every year because the interest rate is lower. And what is interesting here is for equity participation, we start with net operating income, subtract annual debt service. That is a cash flow before participation. And now we need to consider what is the participation amount. So in the example, it specifies the lender will share half of any net operating income above $100,000. So in this case, in the first year, the NOI is $100,000. So there are no loan participation to the lender. You do not need to pay any money to the lender in terms of participation. In the second year, the net operating income is $103,000, which is $3,000 more than the $100,000 benchmark. In this case, the lender will get 50% of $3,000, which is $1,500 for the active participation in the second year. And in the third year, the NOI grows at 3% from the second year. We can calculate the NOI in the third year. Again, in this case, because the NOI is higher than $100,000, so the lender will be able to share 50% of the surplus above $100,000 in the NOI. For the fourth year and the fifth year, the same thing. We calculate the difference between the NOI and the $100,000 and take 50% of that to pay that as equity participation to the lender. So the before tax cash flow in this case will be the cash flow before participation minus participation amount. So we can get before tax cash flow in each year, which is NOI minus debt service give us the cash flow before tax participation. And then we subtract participation from tax flow, cash flow before participation, we get the before tax cash flow. So the difference will be here. Now we need to pay participation to the lender from NOI. And also, to calculate the after-tax cash flow, we need to notice that the participation is tax deductible, so we don't need to pay tax for the participation amount we give to the lender. So in this case, we'll not only subtract interest and depreciation from NOI to get the taxable income, we also subtract participation from the NOI to get taxable income. That is the participation from the cash flow on operation. Now we first calculate the cash flow before participation, which is sale price minus sale cost minus mortgage balance. And for the participation, it equals to the 45% of any capital gains. So which equals to the sale price minus sale cost, which is your net sale proceedings, minus the original purchase price $1 million, which is the gains from the sale. Now 45% of this amount will go to the lender as participation from sales. So here, to get before tax cash flow from sales, we need to subtract the participation amount from cash flow before participation. Again, we calculate the after-tax cash flow from sales. So here is the internal rate of return with active participation, which what we are doing is we just copy again the NOIs for each year. In last year, we add before tax cash flow from operation to before tax cash flow from sales. We have all the cash flow information here. So what we can see here, so in the top part, this is the internal rate of return with active participation. It gives us the 16.88% for before tax internal rate of return on equity and 13.25% for after tax internal rate of return on equity. And on the bottom part, internal rate of return with conventional loan, this is what we just borrowed from the previous example. In the conventional mortgage, when there is like no active participation, and we can have some examples here. So that is the active participation loan example. The second alternative form is called sale-leaseback. Sale-leaseback is the user of the property. They sell the property, sometimes they sell the land only, to a long-term investor. For example, they sell it to a pension fund, trust, insurance company, or REIT. And then they lease this property back from this investor and occupies it on the long-term net lease. Why are they doing this? In terms of the user who sell this property to a long-term investor and then rent it back, the lease payment they pay to the long-term investor every period is tax deductible. And when they sell this property to a long-term investor, they will be able to receive equity capital that will remain available for them to develop their core business. And for the investor benefit, it could be an extremely safe investment because the tenant you have has been occupied this property, have owned this property for very long term. And you kind of know their cash flow. They are really familiar with the whole environment. So it's more certain compared to other investments. And also, this investment is inflation hedge, especially if the lease payment will increase with inflation over time. The important factors for us to distinguish the sale-leaseback from the refinancing. The first is for refinancing, we have strictness of the legal transfer of property, and this must have occurred, and it's really easy to document. And also, you need to have reasonableness of the rental payment. You have to show you have a contract there, and you have the rental payment record. And also, there is reasonable repurchase price if that option exists, and it often does, which means when the user sells the property to the long-term investor in the contract, still have the option to purchase this property back in the specific price range in the future. And we have the actual sale price. And the third type is called interest-only loan. So for interest-only loan, we can have interest-only loan for the entire loan term, or we can have like interest amortization loan. Interest-only loan just means your monthly payment exactly equal to the interest payment. So interest-only loan, you only have no amortization for a specified period, like 3 to 5 years. After that, the loan is either amortized over the remaining terms of the balance, is due as a balloon payment. It's also known as a bullet loan. Now let's look at the second Excel form we have on the course website, the interest-only example. So in this example, for example, you borrow a $200,000 loan. The duration is 30 years and interest rate is 6.5%. Now we're just giving some numerical examples for two types of interest-only loan. Interest-only with balloon payment or interest-only amortization loan. So first, let's look at interest-only loan with a balloon payment, which means if you look at here, so your annual payment just equals to your interest cost, which equals loan amount times the interest rate. That is your annual payment for the interest-only loan. So because the interest payment equals exactly your loan payment, so you have no principal amortization over time, your ending balance always equals to the loan amount. So you are paying the mortgage payment, which equals exact the interest cost every period. At the end of the loan term, you still have to pay the entire loan amount. That is interest-only loan with balloon payment. The second type is called interest-only loan with amortization. Let's assume this is an interest-only loan with amortization where you are doing this interest-only payment option for the first 15 years. And this entire loan term is 30 years. So which means after the year 15, you start to amortize this loan for the remaining of the 15 years period at the interest 6.5%. And the loan amount is still $200,000 because in the first 15 years, there are no amortization. And from year 16 to year 30, we went back to our traditional fixed rate mortgage, constant payment mortgage, where we calculate the annual mortgage payment for each year with 6.5% for the remaining 15 years for $200,000. We can calculate your payment and we can calculate the interest cost. What you can say is the interest payment is a smaller proportion in terms of the total mortgage payment as time goes by. So as time arrived at the end of the maturity, you have a larger proportion for the principal amortization rather than interest cost. And at the end of the period, there are no balloon amount. Your outstanding balance is zero. So this is just an example for the interest-only mortgage. In the first type, interest-only with balloon payment, your payment equals to interest payment for the entire loan term. You end up with the same amount with loan balance at the end of the period. You have to pay off $200,000 at the end of year 30. The second type, interest-only with amortization, you have interest-only characteristics for the first few years of the loan term, but after that, you start amortize your loan, so you end up have a zero outstanding balance at the end of the loan term. So the interest-only mortgage is the same as before, except they have no amortization for a number of years. No amortization means your mortgage payment equals exactly into your interest cost, and the balloon payment is due when the property is sold at the end of the period. And the fourth type we called accrual loans. So accrual loans is a loan for the income properties. Income property means income generating property, which the property you purchase and for investment purpose, not for owner occupied purpose. And the accrual loans is a loan for income property, which has negative amortization. It's similar to the graduate payment mortgage. If you still remember graduate payment mortgage has fixed interest rate along the entire loan term, but the period payment is growing over time at a specified rate, which means for graduate payment mortgage, there are no uncertainty as adjustable rate mortgage about the interest rate, about payment. The only thing is it starts with a really low mortgage payment at the beginning, and the payment increase at a specified rate in the period. So you know exactly at the first day of origination what is your payment for the entire loan term, except these payments are not equal over time. So negative amortization, if the pay rate, which is the interest rate you use to calculate the payment, is smaller than the accrued rate for the accrued loans, which is the contract rate used to calculate interest charged. Why do we have these accrued loans? Again, it tries to give you a lower mortgage payment. So your pay rate, which you use to calculate payment, is smaller than the accrued rate. It tries to give you a lower mortgage payment at the beginning, so you will be easier to qualify for the loan application considering the debt coverage ratio requirement. Accrued loan is usually 7 to 10 years terms. Sometimes the pay rate will increase for a certain number of years. And number 5, we call it convertible mortgage. So convertible mortgage means the lender has the option to buy a full or partial share in the property. In other words, the lender can convert their mortgage balance to active ownership at the end of a specified period. So the lender starts at the position of lender, but if they exercise this option to convert their mortgage balance to become the ownership in the property, they will become an active holder in the property. So that is called convertible mortgage. So all these financing alternatives are usually combined. You could get convertible mortgage with active participation in NOI or interest-only features. These are all the possible combination and features for the commercial mortgages. Payment is the loan amount which you have to pay to the bank at the end of your loan term. The balloon date, which is the time you pay this balloon payment, can be a crisis point for a borrower. The borrower's ability to refinance will be a function of the loan-to-value ratio and debt service coverage ratio at the balloon date. Say you have to pay a big amount of balloon payment at the end of the loan term, and usually you do not have this adequate amount of money. What you can do, and you can refinance, borrow a new loan to pay off this balloon amount. But the borrower might be able to make the principal and interest payment, but not be able to refinance for a new loan to pay off this balloon payment because their income may have declined and the lender may not feel the coverage ratio is sufficient for the amount borrowed. Or the income, they may stay the same or even rising, but interest rate can increase even more and lending to an insufficient coverage ratio. So that will be a crisis point for the borrower when you have to pay off the balloon payment, but you are not able to refinance with a new loan to pay off this loan. Commercial loans, commercial mortgages and notes, they are not standardized. The documents are usually longer and more complex, and often there are no personal liability. The legal borrower for commercial mortgage is usually a single asset corporation. The actual person will be shielded from the liability. Sometimes credit enhancement is required, which means you need to find a third party to provide some kind of credit assurance for your borrowing. Commercial mortgage is usually a partial amortized balloon mortgage, 25 to 30 year amortization, 5 to 10 year maturity. 25 to 30 year amortization, which is the period you calculate your annual payment. 5 to 10 year maturity, which is the period you need to pay off this loan. So we can say for commercial mortgage, because you need to pay off this loan before the amortization period, so usually it ends up with a balloon payment. Let's look at this commercial mortgage loan example here. Consider the following example. The loan amount is $5 million. Annual interest rate is 5.56%. Amortization period is 30 years. Loan term is 5 years. What is the monthly payment? And what is the balance after 5 years? That is the balloon payment. So now let's look at the commercial mortgage loan example, which is on the second sheet of the interest-only loan Excel form. The amount is $5 million. Duration is 30 years, which is 360 months. The period we use to calculate the payment. The term is 5 years with the amount we use to calculate the balloon payment. Interest rate is 5.56%. So we can see the monthly payment. The rate equals to 5.56% divided by 12. The number period is the amortization period. 30 years, 360 months. Loan amount $5 million, future value 0, and end of the period payment, so the type is 0. We can calculate the monthly payment for this commercial mortgage will be $28,577. For the balloon payment, the balance after year 5. So the term is 5 years, which means you need to pay off this loan at the end of year 5. We use the future value function. So the rate is again 5.56% divided by 12. Number period is 16 months, 5 years. The period payment is calculated from the first step, $28,577. The present value is $5 million. So we can calculate the balloon payment at the end of 5 years will be $4,626,692 for this commercial mortgage. And for commercial mortgage, restriction on prepayment is common. Usually there is a lockout period, which is prohibition against any prepayment for up to like 5 years. And why? Because if you think about the commercial mortgage loan is usually in a large amount compared to residential loan. If the borrower refinance immediately when the market interest rate drops, it will be a big loss to the lender. So that's why there is lockout period or other restriction on prepayment for the lender. And the prepayment penalties can take on different forms. It could be a percentage of the loan amount at the time of the prepay, for example, 2 to 3% of the loan amount. Or it can be yield maintenance penalty. Yield maintenance penalty means when the borrower prepay, the lender lost the promised interest payment from the contract. So the borrower have to pay lender the present value of all the losses of interest due to the prepayment to compensate the lender. And also there could be a defensive penalty, which means when the borrower have this mortgage contract with the lender, they have the obligation to pay the mortgage payment every period so the lender can receive cash flow from the borrower. Now, defensive penalty means the borrower must replace the mortgage loan with a set of U.S. Treasury securities, producing an equivalent cash flow. Even the borrower end up the mortgage contract, they still have to replace with some securities which generate cash flow for the lender. So the lender will not lose income because of the borrower prepay. So these are the alternative forms for the prepayment penalty. Mezzanine loan, mezzanine debt is usually a supplement underlying the first mortgage debt. Sometimes it's the second mortgage loan, which means when the amount you borrow from the first mortgage is still not enough to purchase the property, you can get a second mortgage loan or a mezzanine debt. It's often a non-mortgage loan secured by a pledge of ownership shares. So if the borrower defaults, the lender will take over the borrower's ownership position. So if we look at the conventional loan or the leverage with the mezzanine debt, let's assuming it's a 10 million acquisition price. And the property has 1 million annual NOI and 5.5 rate of 65% first mortgage, 12% on the mezzanine loan. You have a higher interest rate on the second mortgage because the second mortgage lenders came after the first mortgage lenders in case of default, so they bear a high risk. So in the previous conventional mortgage, for example, what you can do is you can spend 3.5 million of your own equity, and you borrow 6.5 million at 5.5%. So the return for the equity holder in this case will be calculated as 18.4%, while the return for the lenders will be 5.5% at the contract rate. Now with the mezzanine loan, what you can see in this case, you do not have enough equity. So the first mortgage only gave you 6.5 million. However, you have only 1.5 million equity. So you are 2 million apart from the purchase price of the property. So in this case, you can borrow this 2 million as a mezzanine loan at 12%. So what we can see is with this investment, the first equity holders, they still have like 5.5% to return at the contract rate. The mezzanine debt, they have 12% return on the lending. And equity holders, in this case, they have a high return, 26.9%. So with the mezzanine loan, the investor, they can receive $400 to $2,000 after servicing both the first loan and the mezzanine loan. So their return is 26.9% on the 1.5 million investment, compared to 18.4% on the 3.5 million equity investment. Loan application for commercial real estate. Your loan application for income property will include much more documents than the residential loan application. You have to describe the project in construction, purchase of an existing property, or you're doing a renovation. And you have to describe the loan requested, what the loan amount, what the repayment schedule, and the interest schedule of the loan. You need to provide your financial statement, the tax return for the last 5 years, and also pro forma financial statement for the project, which is the cash flow for the project versus the debt service. We practice these cash flow pro forma examples in the previous lecture and in this lecture. And your own background, your experience with the same project, and your own credit history. Do you have any existing leases on the property if the investment is an existing project? What is the future rental expectation? Is it a short-term lease or long-term lease? What is the tenant quality? The appraisal report of the property, what is the appraisal value for the property, and any environmental study. And the recent court ruling found the lenders are liable for cleanup costs if the property has contaminated or have some environmental issues. So this is the financial leverage and the commercial mortgage loans.